Good evening, everyone, and you're welcome back to my channel. I hope you are enjoying the classes that we have been putting out. Today, we are going to be discussing introduction to the classification of living things. So, we are going to look at classification. Now, what is classification? Classification is the grouping of organisms into different categories and groups. And this grouping is done on the basis of the similarities in the structures and features that these organisms share. Now, as far back as the 1700s, there was a Swedish scientist who was a botanist. His name was Carolus Linnaeus. Now, Carolus Linnaeus was one of the first scientists that was trying to classify organisms on the basis of the similarities that exist between their structures. And Carolus was, or Carlos as some people call him, was one of the first people to classify organisms. Now, in his own classification, at the time when science was beginning and information was being gathered on science, he classified organisms basically into two major groups. He classified organisms into plants and animals. So Carolus was the first person who designed this system where there was classification of organisms into plants and animals. Now, after classifying organisms into plants and animals, now Carolus Linnaeus designed what we call taxonomic ranks. And what are taxonomic ranks? Taxonomic ranks refers to a hierarchical arrangement where organisms are grouped based on particular characteristics and features. And then he designed this method, and there is an acronym that I designed, to use to be able to remember this. And this acronym simply says King Pharaoh classes orders from General Shegun. King Pharaoh classes orders from General Shegun. And this just goes to show kingdom, phylum, classes, orders, family, general or genus, and species. So these ranks are the different ranks through which organisms are being used. It's the ranks that is used to classify organisms on the basis of their similarities. So this is quite simple. Organisms, like I said, he had just two kingdoms, animals and plants. So if you say something is in a plant, it will be in the kingdom plant. And then from kingdom, you have phylum. From phylum, you have King Pharaoh, classes, from classes to order, from order to family, from family to genus, from genus to species. So these are taxonomic ranks, and they are very, very useful. Now we know that when in this taxonomic rank, the lowest at the rung of the ladder are the species, and species are organisms that are very close in genetic similarities. They look alike, they feel alike, and they can interbreed. This is a very important characteristic of the species. They can interbreed and they can, reproduce young after themselves. So this is taxonomic rank, and it is very, very important. When we look at a simple example, let's use two examples to discuss taxonomic ranks. Look at human beings. We know that we have Homo sapiens. Now, when you look at human beings belong to the kingdom Animalia, the phylum Chordata, the class Mammalia, order Primates, family Hominidae, genus Homo, and species Sapiens. Now, for the same example too, we can look at lions, the lions that we find in the wild and in the zoo. They also have their taxonomic rank for classification. If you look at lions, the kingdom is also Animalia, the phylum is Chordata, the class is Mammalia, the order is Carnivora, the family is Felidae, the genus is Panthera, and the species is Leo. Now that is using taxonomic ranks to try to discuss classification of organisms. Now, apart from using this taxonomic ranks, Carlos Linnaeus also designed the binomial method of nomenclature. And what does that mean? In science, this is being used even until today. Now, in science, scientific names have two names. There's the genus name or the general name and the species name. So every organism is usually referred to in science with two names. So you have Homo sapiens, you have Panthera leo, you have Ratus ratus. These are names of organisms. And Carolus Linnaeus was the one who designed this method of using two names to give names to organisms, and this method is even in use even up till today. Then it's important to note that when he designed this method, he designed that these names are Latin, they are Latin names, and then he also designed that when it's to be written, when these names are to be written, first they must be italicized. That is very important. Whenever you are writing any text or any materials, or any material that is in written format, the scientific names have to be put in italics. Now, not only are they being put in italics, the genus starts with a capital letter. So if it is Rattus rattus, the first Rattus is a capital R, and then the second Rattus, which is for the species name, is a small r. So it's italicized, then the genera starts with a capital letter and the species starts with a small letter. This is very important. This is the way that science chooses to name organisms, and that method has been in use even up till today. And then, like I said before, he divided all the animals into just two major kingdoms, plant kingdom and the animal kingdom. And this method was in use. He designed this method in the 1700s, around 1753 to 1758 was when he published a lot of work where he did these different classifications for different organisms. Now, this has been in use even up till today. But then, as science progressed, scientists noticed that this method of classifying of organisms into two kingdoms, that is the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom, was not adequate, because we found out that there are many organisms that did not fit into any of these kingdoms. And then this led to a lot of work being done. And later, in 1969, there was an American biologist, his name is Robert Whittaker. Robert Whittaker came up with a 5-kingdom method of classification. So in his own method of classification, he expanded the classification of all the organisms that currently are known to science and expanded their classification into a 5-kingdom method of classification. The 5 kingdoms that Robert Whittaker designed are the Monera, the Protista, fungi, plants, and animals. Now 5. Like I said before, Carolus Linnaeus just divided organisms into 2 kingdoms, plant and animal kingdom. But Robert Whittaker took it a step further and divided organisms into 5 kingdoms. And these kingdoms, like I said before, are the Monera, the Protista, the fungi, the plant, and the animal. Now, it's important for us to know all these different kingdoms and the examples that we have in these different kingdoms. For the Monera, we have majorly the bacteria and the archaea. They are the most important part of the kingdom Monera. And the kingdom Monera are majorly prokaryotes. We have a video on prokaryotes and eukaryotes. You can go check that out. The kingdom Monera are majorly prokaryotes. They are prokaryotic organisms. Then the other kingdoms are Protista. In the Protista, we have examples such as amoeba and paramecium, and they are eukaryotes. Then after Protista, we have fungi. And in the fungi, we have the mushrooms, we have the yeasts. They are all members of the kingdom fungi. And then we have plants. In the kingdom plants, we have the thallophytes, we have the bryophytes, we have the tracheophytes. These are all classifications under the kingdom plant. And then when we come to animals, animals also have a lot. We have the chordata, we have the coelenterata, we have the arthropods, and many other classifications of phylums that are under the kingdom Animalia. So this is the 5-kingdom method that was designed by Robert Whittaker. Now, even after Robert Whittaker had done this, we still have organisms that we won't call them organisms. We still have non-living entities that do not fit into any of these classifications. A very good example are the viruses. The viruses are not looked upon as living things because they do not fit into any of these kingdoms, any of the 5 kingdoms that Robert Whittaker designed. But the viruses are also studied because they can reproduce and they cause a lot of diseases in both humans and plants and even animals. So this brings us to the end of our class on classification. Classification here, we are talking majorly about the grouping of organisms into different groups based on the similarities of their characteristics. The more similar organisms look like, we group them all together. And then we talked about taxonomic ranks, where we know that we have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. And then it's important to also note that in microbiology, we go lower from species. We also go a step lower to a strain level. We have strains, which are all members of the same species, but they have slight variations. Thank you for listening. Then we also talked about Carolus Linnaeus dividing kingdom into plant and animal, and then we talked about Robert Whittaker dividing into 5 kingdoms: the Monera, the Protista, the fungi, the plants, and the animals. Thank you for listening to this class, and have a wonderful evening.